Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and if you're a long-time listener, then you may have noticed our new theme music written exclusively for the Business of Story by Darius Holbert. He is a remarkable composer whose music I first heard when he scored the film Oh, the Places You'll Go at Burning Man over a decade ago. You can hear that score, meet Darius, and learn how he comes to his magical storytelling soundtracks on episode number 377, titled How Music Composers Use Story Structure to Captivate Listeners. To me, there is something about his storytelling through music that is immensely memorable, which is ideal for the theme of today's episode on how to design unforgettable event experiences and produce sensational stories in the process. And there is no one better than the Director of Experience for Social Media Examiner, Phil Mershon, to show you how to make your events unforgettable.
One of the things that I would encourage you with your event is to create some unexpected moments. So we know that things that are unexpected create powerful memories, and unexpected in a good way. Like, try to surprise and delight people, whether that's on a personal level, creating a moment. So I see you walking alone and all of a sudden I walk with you and find out that the person you really wanted to meet was Jay Bear. And I happen to be friends with Jay Bear. And I say, hey, Park, I would love to introduce you to Jay. Hold on a second. I saw him just a few minutes ago, and I was able to make the introduction for you on your way to your first session. And that was like one of your goals for the event. You're going to feel amazed that, someone took the time to help you meet that goal. So staff that are paying attention and asking questions and creating surprise and delight moments, something bad happened, you spilled coffee on your shirt, I would go out of my way to say, you know what, I'm going to get you another shirt.
Phil has been designing the social media marketing world experience for over a decade. Drawing from over 25 years in creating customized events, he loves to create memorable moments in transformational experiences. In addition, Phil is a saxophonist, a pickleball enthusiast, and the author of the new book, Unforgettable: The Art and Science of Creating Memorable Experiences. Today, you'll learn how to think about event experiences like a film score, how to create micro-customer stories by doing for one what you wish you could do for everyone, how to anticipate what can create a negative story and plan ahead for how to create a positive alternative, and how to expect and leverage serendipity. Phil lives by a bold pledge, and that is no more boring meetings. Who can argue with that? So please welcome to the Business of Story, Phil Mershon. Phil Mershon, welcome to the Business of Story.
Thanks for having me, Park.
You know what? You and I got acquainted about 8 years ago now, I guess. And I got to give a tip of the hat to Lisa Leffler, who is doing a lot of work back in the day with Social Media Examiner, especially social media marketing world. And you, Michael Stelzner, and the team were very gracious in inviting me in to do one of the very first storytelling workshops. And I've been back every year ever since. And much thanks to you and Michael and the gang for doing that.
Yeah, I want to also tip a hat to Jay Bear because I think he's the one who said we ought to take a look at you, and Lisa was definitely close in that mix. So yeah, it's been fun watching how that workshop has been one of the most popular over all these years. And you'd think after some year that people would be like, no, we want to learn something else, but they keep coming back, right?
They do, and you're right. I'm glad you called out Jay Bear, too. He's a good friend of mine, and he completely slipped my mind in that. But Phil, I speak at a lot of conferences around the country and some around the world, and I will tell you that social media marketing world is one of my all-time favorites because I've never seen a group exactly like it in what you all do there, from the greeters to the energy. sometimes you go to these events and they seem a little bit of inauthentic or whatever. You and your team are just like spot on, and you deliver surprises throughout the whole thing. And I am just tickled about your new book out, Unforgettable, because I've seen you in action now for almost a decade, and it's so much fun to peer in between your ears in the pages of your new book. So thanks for sharing your insight with us. And today, we're going to talk about how you approach these events, and in particular, how you take very much of a storytelling or a screenwriting approach to making sure that you have that experience arc that all of your attendees and your presenters and your influencers get to experience. So I'm really excited to dive into all this.
Well, it's fun that you as a storyteller have seen that, and you've even helped me over the years craft some of the stories that we tell. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about some of what's in the book.
So your book, I love the title, Unforgettable. And then right when you dive into it, I mean, one of your first sentiments is how not to create a boring event. And my whole life is about fighting against boredom. That's why we use storytelling. So I've got to ask you, can you take us to the most boring event you have ever experienced? What's the low watermark, Phil, for boring events in your world?
Yeah. So the most boring event I've ever been to, well, it's a fun story. So I was in college and I went to a massive conference, 20,000 people are there, and it's strewn across the campus of the University of Illinois. And they're packing in students. They're letting you sit against the walls, probably breaking every fire marshal code in the book. And the heaters are cranked up. And the content wasn't necessarily boring, but they weren't thinking about how to create a memorable experience, because they were keeping us up late at night, getting us up early in the morning. And the schedule was jam-packed from sunup to sundown for, I think, 4 or 5 days. Somewhere in the middle of it, I'm sitting in one of these sessions and I'm up against the wall and I fell asleep. And I literally yelled out in the middle of my sleep, because I'm a sleep talker. And that's when I knew that this was a boring event. I made it less than boring for the people around me because they heard me yell out in the middle of my sleep. But that event literally put me into such a deep sleep that I was sleep talking. That's pretty bad.
Yeah, that would be a low watermark for certain. Well, what is your backstory, Phil, and how did you find yourself in the event planning, experience, executing world?
It all started when I worked at Boeing Military Airplanes, and I was programming computers, and they took me to this course, and you probably remember because you were the same vintage. They had this course called Total Quality Management. Do you remember that, when that was a whole fad back in the day?
Oh, yeah.
And in the middle of this training, the workshop leader led us through a brainstorming exercise, and I had never experienced brainstorming in my life. And something like unlocked. And I said to myself, I want to do what that guy does. That was amazing. So I went and asked the guy, I said, how do I become you? He said, well, first go become a pastor for 30 years, have a heart attack, be told that you need a less stressful life, then you can have this job. I'm like, well, that's not a very good career path. But it started me on this path of wanting to create experiences. And I set that as a goal that one day I wanted to do that. And about 7 years later, I did get the opportunity. And from that point forward, I've been, whether it's for nonprofits, churches, or in the corporate world, I've been creating training experiences, larger experiences like the one I do now, or smaller experiences for smaller groups of people, for over 30 years.
Well, you're also quite a talented musician. I've heard you play the saxophone many times at Social Media Marketing World, and you've studied it ever since you were a kid. Can you share with our audience here your story about when you moved to Chicago, expecting to hit it big in the jazz scene there?
That's a great story. Yeah, so, I graduated in 2002 with a Master of Divinity, was on my path to becoming a pastor, and I got the chance to go help start a church in 2004. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a great opportunity for me as a saxophonist to move into the jazz world. I'm going to be playing among all the greats and all this kind of stuff. And so I got there, and the church had enough budget that I could hire some professionals, and I was hiring A-level players. So they were coming and they were having a great time with me. And one day one of the guys, that Jose was the piano player, he was without a sax player, and he knew that I was coming to just listen in on his gig that night. He said, "Hey, Phil, can you bring your horn? I can't find a horn player. You can sit in." It was a club called Green Dolphin Street, which doesn't exist anymore. I forget exactly when it went out of business, but it was a famous jazz club, and I didn't know how famous it was. I just knew I had a chance to play sax, and I thought, I'm arriving. Here I am. My mouth went so dry, Park, that I couldn't play. Like, I had water and I was just sucking it, and I was so dry I was sucking the water out of my reeds, and I was embarrassed. The whole drive home with this guy, I did not speak. And I vowed to myself, I'm never going to let that happen again. And fortunately, another friend of mine had told me, Phil, you need to do probably a couple years of woodshedding, which is what Charlie Parker did back when he was 17 and he got laughed off the stage when he first tried to break out as a sax player. They said, son, you need to go. They didn't call it woodshedding because he invented the concept, but they said, you need to go work. So he went and had a physical woodshed behind his house. And for 2 years, he went and just played and played and played until finally when he came out, he was the Charlie Parker that the world knows and loves. Well, I realized I needed to spend probably more than 2 years. So it was years before I had the confidence to do that again.
Well, you stand up on stage in front of those thousands of people at social media marketing world, and I don't see a nerve in your body. I mean, you guys just knock it out and you have fun with the music. And I mean, it's quite a spectacle in all the good ways. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the first time I got to play with Scott Page is when I realized I'd arrived, and not that I got to play with him. When I realized I'd arrived is when he turned to all the other guys in the band that he had hired who, play with the Steve Miller Band and all these famous bands. He said, "Hey guys, meet Phil. He's one of us." That was like, oh my gosh, going from being laughed off the stage in Chicago to, I don't think I ever want to do that again, to being welcomed as one of us was profound. And it comes from years and years of practicing. Like, that fueled me to practice and to put the work in. And what's interesting to me about music, Park, and people often wonder, why do you guys put so much effort into it? And yeah, it started because I'm a saxophonist, but over time, I realized it plays such an important role. The same way in film scores, film scores without music are less than interesting usually, unless it's just a very good narrative. But the music enhances the emotion. And I think music has the opportunity to enhance the emotional journey that people are on within an event. If it is paid attention to, it can actually also pull people away from it. If you have the wrong music or music that's distracting and takes them to another place, it can really be bad for you. So thoughtful curation of a music score, the same way that John Williams would pay attention to for a film score, really does make a difference in an event. And so I've been learning over time how to do that and play the right music, not just what I want.
So you have this interesting intersection of your Christianity and building churches as a pastor and your music, and your main, income now, has been for a while, is creating these experiences. So how or what did you learn from being a pastor and a musician on stage that really informs how you put together unforgettable experiences through the events that you produce?
I knew you were going to ask some great questions. Thank you. I'd say this is actually interesting. So way back in the early days in planning worship services in churches, I learned to study a couple different things about where people were at when they're coming into a room. So I'd study conversations I'd had with people in the congregation that week and what kind of themes did I see. I might look at, if we were going to study a specific passage of the Bible, are there things that it talks about that might stir things up for people? Are there things happening in the local or national news that I need to be aware of? Right after the Hurricane Katrina, we completely shifted the way we led that service. because you couldn't like ignore it. It was, everybody had been affected by it in some way, even though we were in Chicago at that point. And so looking at those kinds of trends, personal, local, regional, and then kind of mental and emotional kind of state of being, and then planning through where are people going to be mentally, emotionally at various points in a service. Well, doing that week after week after week, literally probably planning 1,000 services over the course of my career, trained me in a way to approach the way that I look at a large event like Social Media Marketing World, because it's the same thing. It's just at a much larger scale, and you're looking at different rhythms, but the same kind of journey is taking place. Maybe for some, it's not the spiritual journey, but the emotional, the physical, the mental journeys, the paying attention to where are people at certain kinds of times of the day, how is music factoring in. As a musician, knowing that there's ebbs and flows in the rhythms that we play, the intersection of different people, like dynamics and all that, all those things factor in to creating an unforgettable experience, and knowing that there are things that we do by mistake that cause people to step out. So if I'm a pastor and I'm preaching and it's 11:30 and I know everyone's going to start thinking about lunch, the last thing I should do is tell a story about food because their mind they're going to be gone, right? I can't do that. I've actually got to find ways to pull them back in at that moment. And the same thing can happen at events. If you introduce a thought that is going to cause people to go somewhere else than where you are right now, then that's going to work against you, unless you have some kind of counterpunch that brings them back in with another story that brings them back into the moment and makes it intense again.
All right, so let's pretend we've got a viewer, a listener here who has just produced an event and it did not go as well as they hoped for. Maybe, let's say it's a 3-day event and they just didn't get the buy-in they're looking for. They had people falling asleep in the corner, talking in their sleep, and they come to you, Phil, and they get your book. Let's start from the beginning. What would be one of the first things you would coach them on how to make that event much more memorable?
Well, I think I'd start with who told them it didn't go well. Was it their customer? Was it their boss? What measurements are they looking at that said it didn't go well? Is that a personal reflection? One of the mistakes that we often make as event organizers is listening to a few and assuming that's what everyone experienced. So make sure that the data you have is actually reflective of what really happened. Listen to a lot of people and don't get too emotionally invested for a while. Like for me personally, I will take several weeks before I look at some of the feedback, especially if it's negative feedback, because I want to just take time to say, okay, what really did happen and not skew it. So that said, let's assume that it was still a negative event or has lots of room for improvement. Then I think we just start looking at, well, what are the things that didn't go well? And we'll have to take it, moment by moment. Was it the content? Did we get the content right? Like that's probably, if it's educational, that's where I'm going to start. Let's look at the content because that's what people most likely paid for. That's what you put the most effort into. Did we get the content right? Were the scores from the speakers, reflective of what you would hope for? Are we getting A's and B's on the speaker scores? You're never going to get all A's, but if you're getting A's and B's and it seems like it's what the people were expecting, the comments were overall really positive, then you're going to say, well, if it's not the content, well, if it is the content, then we need to fix that. The next event, we've got to get it more dialed in and study the data of what people say they want, make sure we're getting the right speakers talking to the issues that they care about. People who have the expertise, but also the ability to deliver the content in a way that this audience needs to learn it. So there's a learning forgetting scale that says within 30 days, 90% of what people learn will be forgotten. And I'm going to skip the name on this, the guy who wrote this, but it's a German psychologist who found that people don't retain very much of what they learn unless you reinforce it well. Story does enable us to reinforce things better because people remember stories better than they do facts. But in general, people are going to forget 90% of what they've learned and experienced within 30 or so days.
90%. So, that's amazing, isn't it? That just seems like such a huge number.
Yeah, it's really pretty stunning. I'll get you the name of the guy who wrote that later. Yeah. I'm blanking on his name right now. So that's with the content. We're trying to make sure that it stands out, make sure that it's hitting the mark on the needs that people had. And then I'm looking at the rest of the experience. So most people are not paying for parties. They're not paying for the community. Those are the things they come back for. So if they didn't experience those kinds of things and they're not talking about it on social media, they're not having moments that really stand out for them, then I'm going to analyze step by step with you. Well, how are we doing when we welcome them? Like there's moments that we can have the best impact, and I would want to target the moments that we can really orchestrate, which that welcome experience is one that really sets the tone for everything that happens within the event. That's why you say there's a great energy at our conferences. I know, just like you do, if we met for the first time, and if we have a really good handshake and a first good 5 to 7 seconds, it shapes the way that we're going to engage with each other later. And you and I both know that if that goes poorly, I give you a limp handshake, I don't look you in the eye, it just feels kind of deflating, then there's less interest in continuing to pursue. Well, the same thing happens within the first few moments of an event when people get there. If they feel confused, if they feel overwhelmed, they feel like they're in the wrong place, no one really cares. Like this is like, for me, the classic sign of boredom at an event. It could be a really exciting event, but if when you check in, you get your badge in your bag and you walk through, and then you're sitting there saying, I have no idea where to go. I don't know anyone who's here. That is a very uncomfortable experience to have. And in my mind, that's actually boring because it's forgettable, and it's making me say, I want to leave. I'm uncomfortable. Some people are going to run away in that moment, at least emotionally. It sets them back a little bit, and it's going to take more work to overcome that. Whereas if you have people there waiting to greet you after you've been through that process, saying, okay, now what's next? What do you want to learn? Who do you want to meet? Hey, did you know we've got this going on? Or there's some kind of surprise experience in that moment that draws you in, then all of a sudden. And so that's just one of several moments that I'd look at with you if we're trying to redesign your event, is let's look at a couple of key moments. First impressions, last impressions, and peak impressions are the ones that I look at first.
That first impression thing is interesting, Phil, because when I do speak at Social Media Marketing World, you guys are all kind enough to fly me in, but I don't fly in because I live here in Arizona and I drive. And my wife and I have a great time driving over or whatever, but I'm kind of tired. I get checked in, and then I go over to the event, and I have the funniest reaction, and it happens, I think, every time I show up. It's like you guys have greeters there. They're very positive. They're big smiles. They're waving at you. And I get this sense of, I've got to catch up. My enthusiasm is drained from driving across the desert. I got to catch up with these people. And then when you go get checked in, your people are always so nice, big smiles. I've been there enough now that they will recognize me, and I hear them to other people that come from around the world that have been there several times, and they call them out by name, just like they are a part of a family. And I've never experienced that in another event. So you guys, to me, have really dialed in that initial experience.
I'm going to ask you a live question here, because you're someone that we have in mind who's, you've driven 5 hours, you've flown 8 hours, you've arrived at the event, and you're kind of drained, right? So when you're arriving, you're not necessarily full of energy. So we're setting music on purpose that's hopefully going to invigorate you. But there's something else that we're doing that you may or may not have ever picked up on, but I'm curious if you have. We actually put some aroma into the room that's sole goal is to try to communicate refreshment. So we'll pick some kind of tropical fragrance, chemical free, of course. And we will use that because we know that the tropics, like lemons and oranges and that, just makes you a little bit more perky and happy. And it's part of a very subtle design to help you feel refreshed. Not trying to manipulate you, just help bring a moment of refreshment so that you're like, okay, I'm ready. Even though I'm a little bit tired, I want to lean in and I want to experience what's here. Have you picked up on any of that?
Not until I read your book. And when I saw that, I go, okay, that totally makes sense. But it's not so overwhelming that when you walk in, you get hit with this flood of aroma. So it must work.
Right.
But no, I have not specifically noticed it. And you revealed it to me in your book.
Well, and that's not one that I would expect you to necessarily notice.
Mm-hmm.
It's more subtle. And that's why, Starbucks and those companies can use it in a way that you don't even notice it, and it makes you want to stay and buy more. But I think it can have a powerful effect of helping people transform into the things that they actually paid to do.
Well, Phil, it made me think about in my workshops when I'm going in and spending a half day to a full day with a large brand, is there a way that I could do the same thing? Could it be as simple as lighting candles without looking like I'm too woo-woo or something, but being able to fill that workroom with some sort of calming scent that helps really anchor the concepts that I'm teaching them? Yeah.
Well, here's one of the things that, going back to that research, the guy on retention, he also studied, I think it's Effinghaus. I think that might be his name. He also studied the role of memory in learning. And so the more senses that you can use, and aroma or olfactory being the most powerful, the more senses that you use, the more likely someone is to remember something. So if you only use one sense, then you're not going to remember as much as if you use 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we won't even talk about the sixth sense. That's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But aroma is one that we instantly can associate certain things with if it's the right aroma. And it usually has to be a single source. So I told the story, I think, in the book about when I lived in Kenya and lived next to a sugar refinery, and they use sulfur, which smells like rotten eggs. I can't smell rotten eggs today without immediately going back to that experience, lying in the bed, stomach cramps. Like, I'll get stomach cramps just from smelling rotten eggs or sulfur. It doesn't matter which one it is. I will go get transported back. So that's a negative we don't want, but the same can happen for the positive. Like, certain aromas will take me back to when I dated my wife. She had this fragrance she used, this perfume called champagne. And if I smell that, I'm right back there 29 years
Isn't
ago.
that amazing? So you've got that initial experience. What's the next thing then? I've just had a crummy event that I produced. Phil, I'm at you. And I say, okay, I could definitely step up that initial experience. What would be the next thing I should look for?
I look at all the first experiences. So it's when they walk in the door, but then let's say the next thing you're doing is going into a keynote or going into Park's workshop. What's it like when I get in there? The way people are greeted and the way they feel when they walk into a room is very important to how they're going to show up for the learning that's there. So if people don't seem to care, you're just walking down a long hall, you get into a room and no one's paying attention to you, that's not necessarily a great experience. That can be overcome, but I think it's far better if people are greeting you along the way, being helpful to you along the way. So I think the cheerfulness and the helpfulness of the staff along the way into that first experience. I also think one of the things that I would encourage you with your event is to create some unexpected moments. So we know that things that are unexpected create powerful memories. And unexpected in a good way, like, try to surprise and delight people, whether that's on a personal level, creating a moment. So I see you walking alone and all of a sudden I walk with you and find out that the person you really wanted to meet was Jay Bear. And I happen to be friends with Jay Bear. And I say, hey, Park, I would love to introduce you to Jay. Hold on a second. I saw him just a few minutes ago, and I was able to make that introduction for you on your way to your first session. And that was like one of your goals for the event. You're going to feel amazed that, someone took the time to help you meet that goal. So staff that are paying attention and asking questions and creating surprise and delight moments, something bad happened, you spilled coffee on your shirt, I would go out of my way to say, you know what, I'm going to get you another shirt because I know that's really uncomfortable and really sucky. So I might find you one of our staff shirts to give you for the day until you can go back to your hotel room, or, try to turn things around for you or make things better than you expected. That's what I'm looking for, are your first impression moment. So it's not just when you walk in the building, but first session you go to, first party you go to, looking at each one of those and making sure that we're being very thoughtful about that experience, and then looking for those individualized experiences that we can create, which, I can only do for you what I just described, introduce you to Jay Bear, give you a t-shirt. But if staff are looking for those opportunities to make someone's day, and that's just the whole culture of the way we're approaching it. And I'd say to you, training your staff to look for ways to make someone's day, just, if everyone does that at least once a day, it's going to have a profound effect on the experience everybody's having at the event.
One thing I learned on that personal moment thing, and I do it all the time now, and one of the first places I practiced it was 7-8 years ago at Social Media Marketing World, is you guys put me in a very large room, and we typically get between 500 and 600 attendees for it, which is awesome. I try to get there an hour before, 45 minutes before if it's open. I get my stuff handed out. But then I make my way through the crowd as best I can and go and introduce myself. I don't want to get overwhelmed by all this, but I will go and try to pick out 7 or 8 people in all different parts of the room, introduce myself. What are they there for? How can I help them? And everybody else is listening in on that conversation. And for me, Phil, it does a couple things. It kind of helps me calm down and really sort of understand, start connecting with my audience. But I think it also has that personal connection with them, so they don't just feel like another number in a very large room, and people see me doing it and they're like, oh man, this dude actually cares. And I do care. But it's just such a fun, simple way is just to take a moment to connect with people one-on-one whenever you can, with as many as you can before that event kicks off.
I love that you do that. And I think the speakers who do that do transform the experience that the people in the room have. MCs can do the same thing if they can get people talking to each other instead of talking to their phone, because that is the propensity today, right? People go into a room, they're uncomfortable, then they're going to look on their phone and talk to somebody that's not in the room with them. So if we can get people engaged, I think that can be a really powerful moment. Yeah.
You talk about really understanding your audience and anticipating their needs. You got to share the toothbrush bit, because I didn't know that that's been going on at Social Media Marketing World. And to me, it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. So in 2016, we were moving from a single hotel event to a multi-hotel, or what they call a citywide, which means you've got one destination with many hotels. And that was our first time. And we sat there asking ourselves, well, what could go wrong? What could cause somebody to leave the event and not want to come back? And other than travel plans, we thought, well, we need to solve as many of these as we can. So the top 3 were, someone might want to go back to their room and work. They might want to take a nap, or they might need to go brush their teeth. So we said, well, let's solve all those. The first one was easy. Let's create a space where there's, good Wi-Fi and plenty of tables where they can get some work done. Second, we created a quiet zone, which I'm considering renaming the antisocial zone, by the way, which I think would be just absolutely hilarious. But that's a different story. And then the third one, I'll tell you a story to how we got to it. So Malene is from Denmark, and Malene came to the conference that year, and she had forgotten her toothbrush in her hotel room. So she goes to the information desk and says, is there a drugstore close by where I can go buy a replacement? And they said, well, we can do one better. And the lady said, follow me. And she leads her to the women's bathroom, and they walk in, and there's a basket. In the basket, there's a toothbrush, toothpaste, mouthwash, and dental floss. And she said, you can take one and keep it for the whole event. It's our pleasure. Malene's immediate response was, wow, they've thought of everything, which I know we haven't, but we had thought of that moment. And she said, I'm buying my ticket for next year right now, and I'm going to go tell my friends about it. And this is years ago. So she's been back to the event multiple times, at least 4 or 5, and many of her friends have come to the event. So I know it's a 5-figure return on a $3 investment. And it's just because we try to anticipate where would someone have a problem that would make them want to leave. And, you could argue, hey, that's not the business you're in. Let the hotels take care of that. That's someone else's problem. And in COVID, we couldn't do it because no one wanted to be around someone else's
Right.
toothbrush, let alone brushing their teeth around people. But it's less important that it's about the toothbrush and more important that we're anticipating needs and solving it in a way that we could.
That is such a cool solution right there. Is that one of your most surprising inventions, or do you have anything else that I missed in your book that you're like, man, if you just do this one little thing, it can have such a tremendous impact on your audience, on your attendees?
I think the two big things are that anticipating needs and then empowering people to create those moments that we talked about, doing for one what you wished you could do for many, as Andy Stanley talks about. I think those two concepts are revolutionary. There's a lot of other things that I talk about in the book that, the difference between good and great events is really in the details. And that's kind of the core message of the book is about baking. So we could talk about restaurants or we can talk about baking. And it's the same idea. So the difference between a 1-star and a 5-star restaurant is not so much in what they do, it's how they do it. Because you're going to get served by a waiter or waitress. You're going to order your food and be brought your drinks and all the things in either one of those situations. But it's the way it's all done is profoundly different. At the Ritz-Carlton, they know your name before you walk in the building at the Ritz. I've experienced this. And so they're calling you Mr. Mershon every step of the way. And I'm like, that's my dad. Who are you talking to? But they're like leaning in and they're empowered up to $2,000 to make your experience. A 1-star restaurant, they just want to get you in and get you out. It may be good food. Same with baking bread. All the same 4 ingredients go into every loaf of bread: of flour, salt, and yeast and water. There's other ingredients, of course, but those 4 ingredients go into every loaf. It's not what the ingredients are; it's the type of ingredients and the intention that you put them together. And I think the same thing's true with events, that we have basically the same ingredients in every event, but it's the way that they're stitched together, the thoughtfulness about who is consuming it. What kind of experience do we want them to have at the end of the day? What is substance and what is fluff? A lot of events will have a lot of cool things going on with lights and gizmos and whatnot. But at the end of the day, those aren't the things that create memory. Those are they're cool. They might even make for a good photograph, but are they going to actually make a difference in the life of the person who's sitting in the room? And I would argue that it's other kinds of detail, the attention we pay to each person and their journey that they're having and trying to anticipate the kind of journey they want. I'll tell you something unique that I've just learned recently is the neurodivergent experience events differently than our average customer does. And so they might have a different kind of sensitivity. And so we have to plan for different kinds of journeys that people are having. We know that there's physical accessibility issues, but there's also mental accessibility issues. And we have to make sure that we're planning experiences on account of every person that's walking through the doors. And it's something that event planners are becoming a lot more cognizant of and conscious about the way we think about each one of those journeys that people have.
What was one of the biggest inadvertent mistakes that you made in producing a show that you learned from? And it's like, that sounded like a great idea at the time. We executed it beautifully, but it blew up in our face because of.
I don't know if it blew up in our face, but I'll go back to playing jazz. So the first year we did the conference, Mike said, "Hey, Phil, you play sax. You should use this as an opportunity to play." So I began over the years hiring musicians to play with me at the conference. And we all thought that having jazz music as people walked in for the keynote was a good idea because it's, good background music. And so I did it. And people would be like, "Hey, that's awesome. You're a great player, amazing." Probably 4 or 5 years in, I started to hear some rumblings from staff and others that they didn't think the music was quite energetic enough, or wasn't this or wasn't that. And it probably took 6 or 7 years before I finally paid attention to a principle I should have known in year one of what does the audience actually care about? What is it that they listen to? So, good marketers know who their audience is. And so we knew that our audience tended to be more female than male, tended to be in their 30s or 40s. Both of those are different than me, by the way. And so then I started asking, well, what music does we'll call her a 40-year-old woman, listen to when she wants to feel happy, nostalgic, or feel like she wants to change the world? And then that's when I started to realize, oh, that's a really different set list than what I've been playing all these years. And so we began to change, not necessarily removing sax from the mix, but saying the songs that we play need to hit that mark of being something that's either nostalgic, that's going to put them in a happy place, of saying, oh yeah, this is the music I listened to when I was a teenager and I just was with my friends at the beach or whatever. Or this is the music I played in college when I had all the ambition to change the world. I want to tap into those two emotions. So totally changed the song list, where jazz, is fun for me. And I think this is a big principle for event planners, is we have a tendency to want to plan events for ourselves. And you notice that I said that our audience is not me. I'm not a marketer who works for somebody else's business. I'm not a woman, and I'm not 40 years old. I'm a little bit older than that. I won't tell you how much. And so that's where you have to take yourself out of the equation and say, I'm planning for this type of person. What experience is going to be memorable and transformational for them from start to finish? And literally walk through the same way if you're creating a film score or writing a story. Let's walk from the moment they walk in the building, in the key scenes. You don't have to break it down to every minute, but the key scenes within the story that they're there. What are they feeling? What are they seeing? What are they wanting to do in this moment? How do we help them move to the next step and not leave the ride? I'll use a merry-go-round example where we're on a merry-go-round. I don't want people getting thrown off or stepping off because it's either too fast or too slow. I want them to stay on and keep leaning into the experience and go to the next step. So I think we're trying to walk them through that and then leave them at the end of the event feeling much more ready to go change their world, equipped and remembering.
When you were designing that event, and in your book, you talk about Dan and Chip Heath's amazing book called The Power of Moments. And in that, they have a premise that we remember really two things about an event. That high moment, that moment of whenever it happens, it's like, yes, and then the last moment. And those are the ones that seem to really stick with us. Number one, have you experienced that in your world? Can you corroborate their thinking around that? And number two, like social media marketing world, do you shoot for that high moment that you're trying to get everybody eclipsing at so that they will recall that one major peak? And then, of course, how do you ensure that you close with a bang so that people are like, wow, that was incredible?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the second part of the question first. We've made the mistake of not doing that well on some years where we end with oh, it's over. And we did it inadvertently. So logistics demanded that we take our picture as a staff on stage after the event was over before they tear everything down. So that's what we did. We got everybody out on stage. We took our picture. We didn't realize the unintended consequence. And this is like one of the things you have to think about is getting everybody on stage after the event meant that we had 100 plus people that weren't out in the hallways saying goodbye to people. Like we were more concerned about having our picture moment than we were saying goodbye to our guests and making sure that as they leave, they're still having a great experience. So we reversed that. We did one year. The year we've done it best is when we got Mark Schaefer to end with a bang, literally. You may have been there when we had an indoor fireworks show, and we had confetti guns going off, and it was
the Mark Schaefer
quite the memorable
speech.
Yeah. It was 2019, and that was probably the best time we've ended it well. But I do think people remember how they feel at the end, and so it's important that you have a great closing moment and the way that you send them off. And, I like the world of baseball and what the Savannah Bananas do. When they end their games, they'll bring people out into whatever courtyard they might have at the stadium where they are, and the band and the players will stand around and dance and sign autographs for 30, 60 minutes. And then they have a sequence of things that they'll do to kind of end it and put a finishing bow on it. And then they'll continue to stick around until the fans leave. I think every event has opportunity to do that. That makes you feel incredible. Disney does that obviously very well with their parade. I was talking to a friend last week. What happens after the parade isn't necessarily peak. They just try to make sure it's not bad. Because if what happens after that peak is bad, then that becomes deflating. The walkway to the park exit and getting on the trams out to your cars, that's just like, it is what it is. It's not something you're going to talk about when you get home, but you will remember the feeling of that fireworks show and the parade. And I think the other peak moments, there are collective peak moments that you create, and again, those are surprise moments. Last year, Leslie Samuel, our MC, created a moment from The Matrix when he introduced our CEO, Mike Stelzner, where he got up there and he was dressed as Neo and he asked people which pill they wanted to take. And it was like, very memorable, both on camera as well as just an experience that people will talk about. But I think that more often the things that people talk about personally are the serendipitous encounters that people have. Like the personally meaningful memories are probably more profound. So Disney does that great. Like they know that you want to meet a princess, that you brought your daughter and it's her 10th birthday and she is Anastasia fan. So they'll orchestrate a meeting with Anastasia at some point during your journey there because they've got the technology to do all that. We may not have the technology, but we still have the wherewithal through good questions to create those kind of moments for people. And so I think it is collective moments, recognizing, okay, everybody's going to be in the room at this moment. What can we do that's going to bring us together in a more powerful way that people will remember for a long time? And let's make sure that that's peak. Like that's a really good moment. It's why we put way more effort into our keynotes than we do the breakouts in terms of production quality and all of that, because we know likely everyone at the event's in the room. Whereas in the breakouts, they may or may not. We still put a lot of effort into those, but not as much production effort into those moments.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges, I think, anyways, from a speaker standpoint, looking at an event organizer like yourself, when you do get into the big room and you've been asked to send your PowerPoint, in my case, a keynote over and transfer it over to a PowerPoint, and we're going to read the keynote. AV always seems to be a bottleneck no matter what. And it's not just, your events, it's every event. Whenever I'm like, instead of working off of your computer, we need to give it to AV and they're going to download all the fonts and they're going to have you up and running. And I'm telling you, 9 out of 10 times, Phil, it doesn't work. They haven't downloaded it. All the fonts aren't in there. The clicker's not working or whatever. How is there any way from an event organizer standpoint? Now, this is really the nitty-gritty stuff that the audience doesn't necessarily experience, but speakers certainly do. Do you have any advice for producers out there how to overcome those AV hiccups?
Number one, have a great relationship with your AV company. The more things that you control in general are better, but we have learned over the years that all of our Mac friends are using special fonts that aren't necessarily on every computer, and it does create headaches. And so we've gone back and forth whether we let you use your own computer or ask you to use our computer. There's not a right answer. There's just a best answer for the process of what the AV company is accustomed to and willing to do and what's going to be comfortable for the speaker. But the AV company's got to be on board with you and able to support that. So what can end up being a problem is if the AV company doesn't have control over the techs sitting at the desk. So if you're in a union building, the AV company doesn't necessarily get to decide who's going to be working each room.
Yeah.
They get assigned people, and that person may or may not have the skill set that's needed to do what the AV company's vision was. So that's something that many people also don't realize is, when you're at certain hotels and certain convention centers, you're working with labor that's not completely in your control. And you could get amazing, like we had videographers who used to work on Broadway or have done the Oscars. And then we've had people who clearly had the wrong label next to their name because they didn't know how to do the job that we thought they should be able to do with that job title. So,
well, as a speaker, my job, the moment I step into any venue, is I want to go and meet that AV person. I want to know them on a first name basis. I want to let them know that I completely respect what they do, because I know a lot of times they're sort of the unsung hero of production. And then, they will go out of their way to make it work as best for you as they can. So let's jump to the big stage. Now, you're fortunate because Mike Stelzner, he's a very gregarious, outgoing guy, and he likes to have fun on stage. But boy, we've been to those events too where you get the leader up there and they would much rather be, at home counting their stock options than being up there addressing the audience. What do you do? How do you go out of your way to make sure that keynote speech is really going to land with the audience? And I'd take an example of just this past year at Social Media Marketing World, the whole concept around Back to the Future and how much fun you all had with that, to be able to set that common resonant theme with the whole audience out there and then vamp off of that to be able to make your points. But not everybody can pull that off. So what kind of advice do you have for producers out there that try to bring that CEO alive on stage?
Well, I think you got to know the CEO for sure. And if I guess, first of all, are they okay with you doing some things that don't involve them? And what are they comfortable doing, and what's their sweet spot? So you certainly shouldn't ask a CEO to do something outside of their sweet spot. Like, I've never asked Mike to sing on stage because that's not his thing. He would be very uncomfortable. So knowing your CEO and getting on the same page with what is the vision of what we're trying to create. If you can bring in some kind of creative theme, like a Back to the Future, that's cool. It's not necessary, but it's cool because it opens up possibilities and connections with the audience. Like, we knew that pretty much everyone in the room would have some kind of connection with that storyline and be able to relate to it. And it related to, it's our 10-year anniversary. So we're kind of saying, hey, the last 10 years, 2013 and 2023, it's actually the same message is where he ended up landing. And so it was a powerful metaphor. But you don't need the speaker to create that moment. You can bring in actors, you can bring in others on staff to create moments. As you know, we created some miniature musicals some years to create a memorable moment on stage. We'll have some kind of musical performance that brings in a special thing. There's things you can do with video. You don't have to ask a CEO to speak for 45 minutes. Work with them on their content. Like, we know that in media today, most people are used to 7-minute chunks. So it takes a really good speaker to retain the focus of an audience or the attention of an audience for 45 minutes. So work with them on how are we going to break up your content, and let's introduce different modalities of presentation.
Yeah, you're still trying to orchestrate those peak moments throughout, take them highs and lows and back to the highs again. So let's wrap up this conversation with, the lightning round. And that consists of one question with 3 answers. What are the 3 things people should be thinking about the next time they are planning their big event?
3 things you should be thinking about.
The top 3. I know you got 100. You probably got 300 things to think about. But what are the 3?
Actually, it's the 3 M's. So to make something unforgettable, it takes 3 M's. Make it memorable, make it meaningful, and make it momentous. So make it memorable. What are we going to do that people will still remember 6 months from now, a year from now? Make it meaningful. How are we going to make it personally meaningful for the people in this room? And then make it momentous. Let's create a lot of little moments that are going to create a big moment that are going to make this event stand out and be unforgettable.
And it's a lot easier said than done, isn't it?
It is a lot easier said than done. I'll add one final thing. A friend of mine used to work at Disney, and he said that Disney has an unfair advantage over the rest of us because every day in every park, they get to experiment and try things out and see how it went and see the results and then try it again tomorrow. When you're doing an event once or twice or even 5 times a year, you don't get a lot of data on what worked and what didn't. So you can't take as many risks. But what we can do is we can learn from other people in our industry and find out what they tried. And our collective wisdom can actually be just as powerful, if not more so, than a Disney or anywhere else that has that advantage. So I think lean into that, lean into the community, ask questions of others who've done it. Because if you try to do it by yourself, you're going to actually fall behind.
And I imagine, too, you have to have some pretty decent powers of observation, right? I mean, how often when you're throwing that event are you just walking around and trying to take in what the crowd is telling you?
100%. You've got to be watching for the little cues, the words that they're saying, looking for opportunities. I'm there. I'm trying to reverse at least a couple people's stories while I'm there. That's my job, just like everybody else. And I'm trying to model it in front of everyone, but because I like to do it, but also it sets the tone for everybody else.
Well, Phil, congratulations on your new book, Unforgettable, The Art and Science of Creating Memorable Experiences. Where can people find the book and where can they learn more about you?
Yeah, it's available in all the online bookstores, and they can find more about me at philmershon.com. All my social links should be there, so I'd love to connect with you.
All right, Phil, well, thank you so much. I know how busy you are. You just got back from a big trip, so welcome back, and thanks so much for being on the show with us today.
Hey, my privilege. Thanks for having me on, Park.
Hey, and thanks for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you like what you heard, or you've got some meeting planners in your life out there, or bosses that are asking you, can't you do better meetings for us? Well, share this episode with them, and by all means, get Phil's book, Unforgettable, The Art and Science of Creating Memorable Experiences. And this is unusual for me because in all these years, when I have guests on talking about their books, I don't typically, or haven't been around them, or haven't seen it in action. And I can tell you over the last 7-8 years, I have seen Phil's amazing work at Social Media Marketing World. And it is one of the most amazing experiences, conferences I've been to, and I've been to a lot of them around the world. So this book comes from his heart. It comes from his experiences. And there's so many great tips in there. There's also already things that I'm going to be trying in my own workshops and my own keynotes, and then I'll have to get back to Phil and let him know if they worked for me or not. But anyway, share this episode, get the book, and of course, if I can be of service to you, come on over to The Business of Story. If you have not yet taken the ABTs Agile Communications course, do it now at businessofstory.com/ABT. You will learn how to make your messages land right the first time so that you are creating those unforgettable experiences for your audience, whether it's social media, whether it's in person, whether it's at an event, whether it's just an email. That's the power of the ABT and the and, but, therefore. And until next Monday, when we'll have another amazing story artist right here for you like Phil, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make sure that's epic. Thanks so much for watching and listening.